Everyone ready? Feeling good? All right. This is a talk about feedback. Nathan asked me to give it, and it's supposed to be specifically about peer feedback because that's the thing that we at Labs have debated about a lot lately. So it's a lot of opinion. I feel like all my talks really should just start with an opinion slide where I say, I'm just going to tell you things that I think, and then you can decide whether or not you like those things or dislike those things. I won't be offended either way. But yeah, questions as we go, all of that is fine. So it's a very different talk from the kind I usually give. I'm not really usually a feels talk giver, so I'll try to keep it light, and it shouldn't be too intense. But you know, stop me if you need like a crying break or something. So yeah, should you listen to me? Am I someone who is worth listening to on this topic? So I feel like I've always been pretty good, like pretty decent at giving peer feedback. You know, I have, I would say I was a collection of strengths, but not necessarily super coherent. And then I read this book right here. If any of you have read Difficult Conversations, it's by the same pair of authors. It's called Thanks for the Feedback. And it focuses on, one thing that's interesting about this book is that it focuses on becoming a better receiver of feedback rather than a better giver of feedback. Mostly because the authors suggest that we've spent a lot of time trying to get better at giving feedback and it's not really done us a whole lot of good. So maybe the issue's on the other end. Maybe we need to receive feedback better and understand the feedback that we're receiving better. So the result was, you know, Megazord from all the separate Zords. I feel like this book sort of took a lot of the ideas that I had already and put them into a coherent framework that allowed me to think a bit more robustly about what I was doing and why. So that's part of the aim here. The aim is not going to be like, here are thousands of examples of really good feedback. The aim is to convey that framework and how you should think about feedback holistically, and then tie that into a few examples at the end. But I definitely recommend reading this book. If any of you want to borrow it from me right after this talk, feel free to. I mean, only one of you. But yeah, really good. You should read it. This is like a skim of sections of this book. So yeah, some main things that I want to touch on. At Detroit Labs, we're all chefs, right? So we're all kind of self-starters. So one thing that I think needs to be addressed is what roles feedback should play for us. Do we need feedback? What kind of feedback do we need? Does feedback replace the need to be a self-starter? What limits the effectiveness of feedback from both perspectives, from the giving and receiving sides? And then how we get better at giving and guiding feedback. So what role should feedback play? The first role I'm going to suggest is validation and appreciation. So this is kind of a human thing, not just I want to get better at my job, but questions like, is my work any good? Is the hard work that I'm putting in being noticed? Am I appreciated as a colleague or as a person? Am I liked? These are all questions that we might not typically think of as within the domain of feedback. You know, typically when we say feedback, we mean you tell me a thing that you don't like about me, and then I am supposed to fix that thing, right? So this is the beginning of broadening that definition of what we think of as feedback. So yeah, a very sort of human part of feedback here. The second step is coaching, and this is what we would classically think of as feedback. This is I want to get better. How can I improve? What am I not seeing about myself or about my situation? Where should I aim? And this is typically what we are looking for in our peer feedback, and I think this is what most people think of as feedback. And then the third aspect of this is context and evaluation. So feedback on where do I stand absolutely, or where do I stand relative to my peers, or how am I being perceived? Sort of where do I stand in the context of things? So those are three elements that I would kind of suggest as collectively forming feedback. Does everyone feel good about that? Because if not, like, kind of the rest of the talk is going to be a waste. Okay, so yeah, just before we continue, just to sort of think about how these kinds of feedback fit with the notion of self-directed growth. I spent a lot of time thinking about this and trying to put together in my head, trying to reconcile like this importance of self-directed growth, which I think is like incredibly important. You know, we shouldn't just be like sitting around waiting for people to tell us how to get better, and then we do that thing, and then we hope to get better. We should definitely be working on ourselves and thinking about this ourselves, but I didn't want to say that feedback was completely unimportant as a result of that. So this is my diagram that attempts to reconcile all of that for us. So when we're making decisions and we are trying to grow by ourselves, we take as inputs to our thinking processes any goals and plans that we might have, and what we perceive to be our own strengths and weaknesses. And then using those inputs, we make decisions and we take actions. And then this important like cyclical bit of self-directed growth is that you like observe the results of the decisions and the actions that you made and took, and feed them back into your understanding of your goals and plans and strengths and weaknesses. And it's this cycle which helps you actually improve rather than just like make the same decisions over and over again. So this is where feedback enters the loop, as well as your observations of the decisions that you took and the actions that you undertook. Others will also observe those things. So this is the point at which feedback that you receive is entering this cycle. Other people can tell you things, and they can tell you things that complement your own observations. So they can tell you things that you would not otherwise observe. They can tell you about your impact on them personally, for example. That's something that you can very rarely accurately gauge by yourself. Or it might just be, you know, you think you're doing this coding aspect fine, but really there's a much better way of doing it, and you're just unaware. So others' observations augment your own observations, which in turn feeds back into your goals and plans and strengths and weaknesses. You might change your understanding of what your own strengths and weaknesses are based on feedback that others give you. And you may have a better understanding of your broader impacts, your impact on, you know, the team around you, not just like, do I write good code, but do I write good code in a way that is respectful to colleagues, that kind of thing. So the goal would be that by combining this self-directed growth with appropriately inserted augmentation from feedback, that you end up making better decisions and take better actions. So that was the way I ended up reconciling the importance of these two things. It's kind of a complicated looking diagram. Hopefully it makes sense. Like, these are complementary skills and complementary aspects to growth, not in competition. So yes, this is what if the first part of the talk, if nothing else is remembered from the first part of the talk, this picture and this concept of ACE feedback with appreciation, coaching, and evaluation all being components of well-rounded feedback, this is the thing to take away from that first section of the talk. So this is what we should be aiming for, feedback that addresses all of these things. With me so far? Okay. So what limits feedback efficacy? What can cause feedback to not be as effective as we would like it to be? So one thing is shortfalls. Shortfalls here, I mean, maybe the next slide will be a little bit more clarifying for this. So here's an example. So this is not our bill, by the way. I should clarify also, none of these examples, unless I specifically say, are specifically directed at anyone or at any processes. These are, you know, the hypothetical cases. So let's assume that the bill gets lots of appreciation, but that he doesn't get as much coaching or evaluation as he would like. So as a result, Bill can feel like lost and stagnant in his role, even though like people are telling him the whole time that he's appreciated. He knows he's appreciated, but he doesn't know like what to do to get better or where he stands within you know, the company or with respect to his peers. Don't be like Bill. So this applies not just with a shortfall of coaching or a shortfall of evaluation. It can happen in all combinations of the three. So maybe you get a lot of coaching, but you never get appreciation. Then you'd feel like, why am I nothing I do is ever good enough. I'm always being told how to get better. I'm never being recognized for the things I already do. Or with evaluation, you might say, well, yeah, people are appreciating me and telling me how to get better, but I don't know better relative to what. Am I trying to keep my job or trying to become the best developer ever? So shortfalls here refers to a relative lack of one of these components of feedback. A second limiting factor in feedback efficacy is labels. So here is an example of someone being very generous and giving you, Mr. Blue, some very valuable feedback. Their feedback is, be more confident. Is everyone clear on what that means? No, right? So that's what's actually said, but it's really secondary to what's being thought. So Mr. Green is thinking, what you should actually do here is be open about what you don't know. If you don't know something, be confident enough to say, I have no idea what that means. Can you, help me or explain it to me? But Mr. Blue is he's telling me I should just bullshit more. If I don't know something, I should just pretend to know and project confidence, even if I'm totally unconfident. So this is a clear communication issue, right? That generic label of confidence was far too broad to actually convey the nuances of what was attempting to be said here. So this is definitely a trap that's very easy to fall into. Wrong spotting is a third way we can reduce the impact of our feedback. So this quote is from Stephen Covey, who wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And he says, most people do not listen with the intent to understand, they listen with the intent to reply. A good observation, solid advice. Here's my remixed version of this. Most people do not listen to feedback with the intent to understand, they listen with the intent to justify. So I know this is a narrative that happens in my own head. Someone gives me feedback and I start immediately thinking, well, is this accurate feedback? Is this really true? Do I believe this applies? Do I respect the person it's coming from? There's a whole narrative that's not explicitly about saying, well, this person is wrong, but it's a very natural process to start analyzing immediately and think, is this truly applicable to me? Do they understand? Whether or not you actually say that back to that person, you might have this internal dialogue without explicitly saying, well, I think you're wrong because of this. You can still be challenging that feedback in your own head. So an example of this would be feedback that challenges your identity. So if someone says to you, you need to be more confident, and you think you're the most confident person in the world, you will probably immediately start thinking, this is terrible feedback. I know I'm confident, and anything else that they suggest to you that might be valuable will be way over your head as you spend all this time thinking about, is this really good feedback for me? Is this valuable? There's this reaction that you have to attempt to reconcile what they are saying about you with what you believe about yourself. So in this case, if we told the tomato that he was actually a fruit, and then a whole bunch of other feedback that was really useful for Mr. Tomato to hear, he might spend the whole time just worrying about whether he's a fruit or a vegetable, and discard, not listen to the rest of our feedback and discard the rest of our feedback if he thinks it's too challenging to his sense of self. A second example could be if you're getting feedback from someone whose opinion you are, let's say, in this case, not fully respectful of. Maybe you think that they're not qualified to be giving you that feedback, or maybe they're delivering the feedback in a way that's not super conducive to you calmly accepting and understanding it. So again, in this case, if someone is shouting their feedback at you, you're probably much more likely to be worried about the shouting that's going on and getting ready to reply and respond and justify to yourself, rather than actually looking at the feedback as it's given, independent of all the emotions, and analyzing it on its actual qualities. So, everyone happy with all those suggestions so far? Making sense? Okay. So then, the obvious next step is, how do we get better at dealing with all of these things? And this is probably the most opinion-heavy part of the talk. This is where I had to do a lot of cherry picking of lots and lots and lots of very good suggestions. So I'm going to split it up into ways you can get better at giving your feedback, ways you can get better at receiving and soliciting feedback, and then at the very end, like some directions for working on this together as a pair, because there really is, a dialogue that has to happen here. So the first step as the feedback giver is to appreciate often, even for everyday stuff. People doing their jobs, appreciate that. It makes your life easier. So again, I'm just going to pull a few examples here, and I'm not anonymous in this, but other people will be where appropriate. So this, for example, this is not a comment that actually is going to change any code or suggest anything different happen. This is just a recognition that someone has done their job, done it well, and it's going to make my life slightly easier. So this sort of harkens back to the idea that feedback is broader than just coaching. This is appreciation as a part of feedback. Same thing here with, this was in the CI room. Jeff Kelly, updated some security stuff on the nodes. This doesn't directly impact me. It will indirectly impact me, but there's no harm in expressing my appreciation for someone else who's gone and done a job of their own volition that's beneficial to everyone developing here. This is one way in which Detroit Labs is very good at expressing appreciation. Delicious food. You might not think of it as, feedback, but it kind of is, hey team, I brought you these bagels or donuts to say thanks for working hard. An explicit thank you note or card could count here. This is perhaps a little bit less every day, but these are still examples of ways in which you can express appreciation for your teammates. And then I like this story. I don't know, is Chelsea here, or is she busy releasing the... Okay, so I asked her this question before, as I was preparing this talk. I said, when I give this Detroit Labs talk on feedback, I'm going to tell the Mountain Dew story. Would you prefer that I mention you specifically, or that I don't? Either way is fine. And Chelsea's response was, what Mountain Dew story? So I'm going to tell the story now, and then it should be clear why this is, what the message is from this. So basically, I was having a shitty day on the project, and Chelsea went to Jazz and brought me back a Mountain Dew without asking me if I wanted one, or asking me if I wanted to go. She just went, brought it back, and just put it on my desk. And it was just really validating to have someone recognize that I was having a shitty day and do a nice thing for me. And the message being told here is it was super important to me, as a person. That was a really nice thing. And it was not as big a deal for Chelsea. She was just yeah, this is just an easy thing I can do. But it was something that was really impactful. So look for opportunities like that where the impact to you is small, but the potential impact to the recipient is large. So I should say one thing before I go on to the next section. The reason I want to put forward this idea that appreciation all of the time is a good thing is that it sets a good tone for any other feedback that gets given. So if you feel appreciated by your team and you feel that they understand you and are respecting you, it makes it a lot easier to hear any feedback that comes later that's aimed at improvement. It makes you believe they have your best interests at heart, and so it's much easier to accept when they say, this is a thing you could improve, that it's a thing that they are suggesting to you because they believe it's good for you, not because they're being critical of you. So another suggestion for the giver is to coach details as you go, again, day to day. So other examples here. This is a PR that someone had opened, and Jeff commented just with a couple of very small details, you can use this constant instead of actually hard coding 1000. And because of the type inference here, you can omit using this prefix for the enumeration. It's not important what the feedback actually is. What's important here is that the code functions the same way with or without these suggestions. These are just minor details. But over time, as you collect, this as you collect feedback on all the minor things you could be doing better, it makes you just that little bit more precise as a developer. So anything that's kind of not a big deal but is a nice to have, feel free to like proactively comment on that and coach on that as you go as a developer. I'm not so sure how this applies to non-developer roles, but my perspective is somewhat limited. So. This is kind of the same example. So when someone asks like a fairly simple question, should this be like a double equals instead of a single equals, you can proactively provide coaching there. So one possible answer to this question would be no, full stop. Like that is the answer to this question. The answer is no, it should not be this. So spend that little bit of extra time to proactively coach and provide context and background information on all these sort of little things. So now let's divert and talk about leveling up as recipient, which again is the sort of core premise of this book, is that the responsibility largely lies with the recipient. So one of the things that's super important to receiving feedback well is to cultivate a growth-based identity. And I don't have like a magic bullet for doing that. I sat down to try and write slides that would help people become growth-based. And I was like, this is a whole field by itself. I can't possibly give like a good recipe for doing that in this talk. But here is like the best summary I could come up with, thinking about what I do and which of the things I do that I think are most valuable. So the first thing is target becoming an expert learner, not an expert doer. So having a growth-based identity does not mean you have to throw away the idea that you are working to become really good at something. It's just that you change the thing that you're becoming really good at. So rather than wanting to become an expert on subject matter, become an expert on acquiring that subject matter. Makes you much more flexible. Second suggestion is seek a broader understanding of the context of things. So a lot of discussion on PRs will be, factual. Like, is this correct? Why? Like, is this correct? You should be using this here. When you have the opportunity, look for the context. Ask why this is the case. Like, why do I have to use equals here? Harkening back to the previous example, the answer in that case is that's just the way the language is, but that's still valuable information. Other times you'll ask why, and you'll get some super useful context about, the history of Android and how it arrived at this point, let's say. So always be looking for that broader understanding rather than just focusing on what you can learn right now to get the job done. And then another thing that I find really useful for this is making sure you ask questions about the process that someone went through to get to understanding a particular thing. So rather than say, expert Jeff Kelly, like, what is the answer to this thing? Say, expert Jeff Kelly, what did you do in the past that led you to knowing about this thing? Like, how could I know to do that next time? And understanding that process, again, is about becoming more of an expert learner and less about an expert on knowing all of the things there are to know about iOS or about Android. So that's kind of a very brief summary of a growth-based identity. And I think, Nate West, you posted a really good article, I forget when, that linked a book called Mindset that's very much on my reading list that hopefully would provide a bit more of a structured answer to how to become a growth-based, or someone with a growth-based identity. This is a big thing as well. As the recipient, it's important to ask for what you need. So this is not making people play the mind-reading game. And hopefully this is also a little easier to think about now that we've discussed this structured kind of feedback where there are 3 different components. So before you might have said, well, yeah, I'm getting coaching, I'm getting feedback, and what you meant was I'm getting coaching, but you might now be able to say, well, I don't have enough evaluation. Like, I see I'm being told what to work on, but I still don't know where I really stand relative to my peers. So suggestions for each of these. For appreciation, make sure you are expressing your own appreciation. So one of the easiest ways to solicit appreciation from others is to be an appreciative person and appreciate them. It's sort of a you do a good thing and it multiplies and magnifies. And the other thing is, don't be shy about making sure your own accomplishments are recognized. And now we have a really convenient way to do that, which is bubbling up via the small council things that you did that were cool, so that people get to see and appreciate those things. For coaching, the best advice I have for this is just asking questions a lot. People here are very happy to answer them. And again, ask the right kinds of questions. Ask the questions that are that give you context or help you reproduce something the next time around. Don't ask the questions that are like, I need to do this, tell me how to do it. That's not a good question. Questions about context and broader understanding are much more valuable to you. So I characterize this as always be chipping, always be like chipping away. So this is a question I posted just a couple of days ago on, this is on an open source project, so the language is a little more formal than I would perhaps use if it was internal. But I just asked, out of curiosity and a desire to learn, what is this thing that they had referred to in the previous post? And why do these rules help with that issue? And then expressing appreciation in advance. And they replied and gave me some good information and some good context that helped me understand more about this particular project that I was reading about. So don't be shy to ask those things. Those are the most valuable, and they're also the most interesting, and they're also the questions that I enjoy answering the most, because I know there's value being conveyed rather than just information. And then suggestions for getting more evaluation. One thing that was really good, I forget exactly when Nathan sent this out, but there was a long email that went out with a sort of list of labs career progression. And what that really provided was a list that you can look at to measure, to sort of self-evaluate, if you like. So you can look at that list and say, well, this is what Nathan says is a rough outline of how your career progresses. Where do I feel I lie on this timeline? And that will then give you some ideas as to what the next logical steps would be. And this is also something that I think, this is something that one-to-ones with the co-founders are really valuable for. So this is a good example of me being okay at feedback before, and then now that I've read this book and understood the different types of feedback, having a much clearer view of what I was doing. So my last one-to-one with Nathan, which was last year, I asked him, the first question I asked him was, how would you summarize what I have done at Labs in the past year? And it was really what I was doing now, I see, was asking, what was your evaluation of me, and does it match with my own evaluation of myself? It was a calibrating question. So the co-founders have the broadest picture of all on Labs and where you are in terms of your progression within Labs. So I think the one-to-ones are a really good place to explicitly ask for this in that kind of way. So then, leveling up together. This is the part that requires dialogue back and forth, and so can't really be addressed in isolation by either the giver or the receiver. It's best attacked from both ends. And the big thing here is that whole labels issue that we came upon earlier, and it's a difficult one again to give very good examples for. But this is what people typically say when they say be specific about your feedback. What they're talking about is not just giving this labeled feedback that doesn't really tell you a whole lot. So as a reminder, this was the case we were looking at there, where confident can be interpreted in a bunch of different ways. So this is what's actually happening when that feedback is given. The feedback giver has observed something. They have some raw data that they're basing this feedback on. And in between that raw data that they observe and the thing they say to you, they're also applying a layer of interpretation. So in this example, let's say they observe that you don't talk as much to colleagues as you could. And they're thinking, oh, this is because of a lack of confidence. But there's a contextual layer there where they are comparing you implicitly to what they know about other people or what they think about themselves. So maybe you're talking less than they are, and they see that as a sign of a lack of confidence. And then the same is true between you hearing the label and you determining what it is you're actually going to take away, what the advice you perceive to be is. You hear the label and you apply your own interpretation to that label. So in this case, the label was confident, and the recipient said, my interpretation of you telling me to be more confident is that I need to bullshit more. So breaking down, rather than just conveying the label and thinking of the label as the finished product in the feedback, it's important to try and go through all of these stages and figure out what was the thing that I observed that I'm basing this feedback on, before I explicitly tell you how I interpreted that. And then as the recipient, it's important to say, well, you have told me this. What do you actually mean? Like, what are the examples that you observed that led you to this conclusion? And what would your advice look like if I was to implement it? What specific actions can I take that would resolve this in your mind? So imagine asking those questions in the previous scenario. You would get a lot more insight into what was causing this person to think of you as not confident enough. And you would have much more actionable suggestions at the end of the day to take away and work on. And hopefully more relevant ones as well. So the target for the giver is to try and proactively and factually describe the data, the interpretation that you apply to that data, and specific actionable suggestions. So this is where the specificity comes in. Steps 1 and 2 are typically addressed less. So it's also very difficult sometimes to separate the actual data from your interpretation. You might say the data was, I observed you not being confident. That's actually not the data, that's your interpretation. The data was like, I observed you not talking enough. So try where you can to separate those two. It will help with understanding, if you understand the actual events, it will help you with understanding what the appropriate resolution might be in those cases. And again, when you're giving suggestions as to what should change, these are goals. Perhaps not every aspect of SMART applies. You don't need to specify when this feedback needs to be considered by, but certainly think about a goal is easier to absorb and adhere to if it's specific and measurable and obviously attainable. And then as the recipient, when you're in a conversation like this, try to drive at those same issues. Rather than just accepting the label at face value, if it's not proactively given to you, try to ask questions about where the label came from. What was it specifically that you saw me do that led you to this conclusion? Avoid thinking about the feedback too critically as it's given to you. Avoid sort of neglecting to listen to feedback if it comes from a source that you're perhaps not as happy listening to feedback from. Try and evaluate the feedback on its own merits regardless of where it comes from. And the same goes for advice in this case. If you are given a generic label as your advice, try to push for a more specific breakdown. So if someone says to you, be more confident, ask them, what would that look like? What specific things could I do in order to improve your perception of my confidence? And then finally, to close the circle, appreciate the feedback that you get. Thank people for the time that they spend giving well thought out feedback. That's all I have to say on this. And in the spirit of things, if you have any feedback, here is a way you can give me feedback on this talk, anonymously or not. Maybe you can practice some of these things. Maybe you can tell me you think they're all wrong. I don't know. Yes?
So when we first started working with the team, we were doing pull requests and commenting on each other's pull requests, and there was a lot of tension there. And I think a large part of it was because we didn't know each other yet. But how do developers get good at giving and receiving feedback on PRs, not just within our little Detroit labs?
So I think especially if there is, as you say, this new integration of two teams, I think that having appreciation be expressed in PRs is something that doesn't by default happen a lot. So I know that here at Labs, once I've worked with someone for a while, I may skimp a little bit more on the appreciation and just get to the commenting and the coaching, because I know that they trust that I'm commenting and coaching for a reason. Perhaps when it's two teams joining together, explicitly having the teams say, hey, this is a great piece of work in this PR, as well as here's something you can improve, would give a more balanced version of, you would avoid that shortfall of people feeling like they're being told, you should do better all the time without anything that they're doing right being recognized. Yeah.
Thing where, goes back to earlier, it says don't be Bill.
Don't be Bill, yeah.
How can you like get some of the things like say, like you mentioned, you get appreciation a lot, but you don't get a lot of coaching. Do you go out on your own and get it, or do you wait for people? Or?
So the ideal is that now everyone's listened to this talk. Everyone goes and proactively gives coaching, and will also ask for coaching if they need it. But yes, in the sub-ideal case, again, like the premise put forward by this book is we've spent a lot of time telling people, hey, you should give people coaching. But at the end of the day, it's valuable to you as the recipient, so you should be prepared to ask for it as well. So yeah, I will often, and again, in the context of PRs, if it's a PR where I'm not certain about something or where I feel like I've accomplished the task, but it could maybe be done better, I would explicitly invite feedback. Like I am looking for feedback on this specific piece of work to make it clear to people and to make it obvious what I'm actually looking for. So yeah, don't be afraid to ask for coaching. It's helpful if you have specific things in mind, not just how do I get better as a person in that life. That's kind of difficult to answer. But if you have more specific things that you're looking for, then taking them as examples to someone and saying, what would you do in this case? Or what do you see that could be done differently?
Hey, Stu.
Yeah.
Us on the Hangout are having a difficult time hearing questions. Would you mind, before responding, just to rephrase what was asked?
Yes, sure thing. That was Claude specifically asking about getting coaching and what to do, sort of whose responsibility it is if you don't feel you're getting enough coaching.
I wanted to say that when you finally get to the point where you're able to ask for coaching with confidence and not so much like worried about what people think, it's so freeing, right?
Yes.
It's such a relief to be able to ask your peers for help without fear of them judging you or whatever.
Yes, yeah. So that's Terry was saying. It's actually a feeling of relief when you get to the point where you feel like you are free to ask questions without judgment and without your peers being irritated with you. And I think there's two aspects to that. One is that you are receiving enough appreciation that you know that people care about you, and the other side is feeling secure enough in your own growth-based identity that you want to ask those questions and you don't mind being told if you're wrong. You are actively seeking out people telling you you're wrong so that you can improve on things.
I think you really nailed it when you talked about that people listen with the intent not to understand but to reply. When I'm giving feedback, I always look for ways to, minimize the likelihood that somebody's going to be defensive or respond negatively. And one of the things that I found to be really useful is to just say, hey, are you open to some feedback on X thing? Is now a good time? And almost always the response to that will be, oh, yeah, or yeah, but right now is not great. Can we talk at this time? So I find that goes a long way to kind of set the tone for the conversation.
Yeah, I like that. That's very nice.
I was just going to say, and I think that what Eric has said kind of can address this theory that I have is, you said that when you're giving feedback, you want to start with facts, provide your interpretation, and then provide advice. One of my fears is, what if my interpretation is not the way that the person giving the feedback to interprets it? It kind of butts heads with if the person receiving the feedback is being a good receiver, they're not going to be defensive and explain it. So I could walk away thinking, I just did a good thing, like, here's the fact, here's my interpretation, but it was way off, and here's my advice. Kind of reconciling those two is one of the fears that I have, but kind of starting in the way that Erica mentioned, I think could be a good way to start in a positive way.
Yes. Yes. So to paraphrase for those on the Hangout, that was Tim saying that he often worries about if his interpretation doesn't match that of the person that's receiving the feedback, even if they are agreeing on the data that's the basis for that, but that Erica's suggestion as to how you prepare for that conversation plays a big part in helping with that.
Do you have any other thoughts also going to that?
Yes, I should skip back to this slide as well because this is relevant and I forgot to emphasize it at the time. The one bold word on here is suggestions. So I try to be like as humble as possible when I'm giving feedback. All I'm doing is giving suggestions based on my perceptions. You know, I actively recognize that this is what I see, and like there's a whole lot about you that I really don't know. Like I have such a limited view of you as a person that all I will ever do is use language which is very explicitly like, you may want to try this, or this might be useful. I'm never going to dictate to someone like, this is how you should do this thing. And I find that also, you know, softening that language is also helpful. Like very explicitly acknowledging, hey, I know you might disagree with me on the interpretation. This is what I see, and this is what I have found personally helpful, or this is what might be useful for you. Yeah, right.
I always find sometimes it's good practice to feedback.
Mm-hmm.
If you have like a certain way you're most comfortable like giving feedback, you can't always assume like someone else knows that. So when they're giving you feedback, in one of the ways you can appreciate that is like, I really appreciate you giving me this feedback, but you know, next time, you know, if you notice something, could you give it to me in maybe this fashion?
Mm-hmm.
And or you know, when you said this thing, and then that also helps the feedback giver tailor their feedback style. So it's kind of like a give and a take in that situation where both people are uncomfortable, but like you're helping each other grow in how to give that feedback and how to receive it as well.
Mm-hmm. So Brandy's suggestion was that when you receive feedback that you appreciate that, but then if there are any suggestions that you have for the next time you receive feedback, to give those to the feedback giver as well, so that they are equipped better next time to give you feedback in a way that's most appropriate for you. The one thing I would caution about there is there's a very specific phrase or phrase pattern that's very easy to fall into, which you fell into there, and which this book addresses, and it's a very small thing, but I think it's actually very interesting. Your suggestion was to say, thank you for the feedback, but next time this would be better. And this book calls out this idea of using but as a qualifier, as a way that actually diminishes the appreciation, like inadvertently. So you're like saying, thank you, but also can you do better? So the suggestion is, in situations like that, replace the word but with the word and. Yes, so just say, like, thank you very much for the feedback, and, like, just for your information next time. So rather than using but as a qualifier that kind of weakens the appreciation implicitly, using and to make it clear they're two separate but related things, but without sort of depreciating the appreciation. Yeah.
This is a really cool talk, and I think it's nice and generally applicable to most, I think, professional roles, especially trade labs. I think you could do a specific, and I would definitely enjoy a specific talk just targeted towards developers and like a developer conference that really like sort of to what Janae was saying. I think there are some very specific scenarios, communication modes like PR comments, and just type and like personality types or issues on development teams that I think you could really like I love the PR comment example, obviously because it's like really relevant to me because that's where I give and receive feedback a lot, and also where I've seen it break down really horribly.
Yes.
So one specific question about that is one scenario that I kind of am unsure of and have like a fear of is when I'm working on a team on a code base with someone who's maybe newer to software development and acknowledges it and has a lot to learn, but it's also because they're newer, they're understandably very like, you know, self-conscious about what they don't know. In the event they submit a pull request where there's like a litany of not necessarily things that are bad, but litany of suggestions. I think like you, I tend to be pretty verbose with my comments, and they're all given as like, oh, here's the thing to consider, here's the thing to consider.
Yes.
I'm not expecting that you actually address all of my things. It's just, here's the thing to consider.
Yeah.
And I worry sometimes that if I give a long, if I like, you know, comment on a ton of lines of like, did you know that you could do this, or did you know that you could do that, that they'll take that as, I'm terrible and I'm just or that they are terrible and I'm like assaulting them and just like saying that everything they did was like worthless. Like, do you have any like? Is there a way to do that that you think of that is less likely to end up into that negative place, or is it better in that scenario to just maybe withhold every other comment?
This is a good question for me. Brian's smiling at me because I do. Yes, you're right. I do the same. I am not shy about posting comments. I think. So sorry, just to repeat the question for the Hangout. Dan's question is about if you're commenting, let's say on a PR from someone who's relatively junior, and there's a lot that you would like to comment on, not necessarily a lot that has to change, but a lot of suggestions that could be changed for slight improvements. What is a good tactic for commenting on that PR, but not overwhelming or seeming too aggressive with your comments?
Like a coaching fire hose almost.
Yes, exactly, like just blasting them away. Again, I think the one thing is to make sure that there's appreciation in there somewhere. And I also think that there's a clear prioritization that can be put in place for this is a thing that needs to change, and this is a thing that's nice to change. And although I generally will comment a lot, I will sometimes also hold a little bit back on the stuff that's nice to change, especially if there are external factors like this is a client project and there's a deadline, so speed of cards is important. So there's also some context you can use there to inform you. If it's on like an open source project that we're working on where there's no timeline, I'll probably comment until everything is until I'm happy with everything. But yeah, the best thing I think is that appreciation in there somewhere. Even if it's one bit of appreciation and 20 comments, it's way better than zero appreciation and 20 comments.
How do you feel about like keeping the PR succinct to the project and then taking the rest of the comments and bundle them like offline or in an email or in person?
Terry's question is about, or a suggestion really is, perhaps commenting on the PR only on the issues that are necessary to resolve for the actual card, but then taking any additional suggestions offline and communicating them through a different medium. Never really thought about it. It's kind of I kind of like it as an idea.
Or sometimes in the past what I've done is instead of calling an individual out on a bunch of stuff, I just give a presentation on all the stuff that I thought to the group. Right?
That also works. The issue I'd be worried about with communicating some of the issues separately is that one of the things I like about PRs is that they provide a resource to look back to for others who've joined the project. I often find myself referring back to comments that I've made on a PR previously that explain the same issue.
I get that, but it's a very public medium, and sometimes, especially juniors, you might want to have more of a one-on-one.
Yes, yeah, I can definitely see that, and that should be part of a dialogue between those two people if that becomes an issue, I think. And it's part of the responsibility of the receiver to say, hey, this is a lot of feedback that's making me a little bit uncomfortable. Do you think we could discuss anything that's not primary via email or in HipChat?
Maybe there's like a PR version of sort of what Erica said, where you say like, hey, so I was just about to review I was reviewing your PR, and there's really only like one thing in there I think that like you might seriously want to consider. But I had a lot of other feedback. Like, do you like receiving that feedback in the context of a PR? Like, do you want me to add those things, or would you rather I just sort of keep those out of the PR or something? You know what I mean? Like maybe see how open up if that person's ready to receive it, or if they're going to be
right.
Take it very negatively.
So Dan's suggestion is perhaps apply what Erica said earlier to PRs and say, comment on anything that's critical on the PR, but then actually ask the recipient or whoever opened the PR how they would like to receive non-critical comments. I don't know how I feel about that. But based on, again, my preference for having the record be visible and something to refer back to for my own purposes and my own learning as well as for others. But again, it's at that point it becomes more of as long as the critical stuff is getting fixed visibly, it's definitely much more of a personal preference thing between the two individuals involved, I would say.
I think in an ideal world, we all know that we are not our code, and a critique of our code is not a critique of us as a person. And in that sense, and for the sake of community learning, I agree with keeping feedback public on PRs. But maybe there's just, there's a piece of sensitivity there, knowing that, well, that's the ideal. Like, some of us get really attached to our code.
Yes.
So, just I think sensitivity on both sides.
Right, yes.
I find it particularly difficult just given that it's like so very asynchronous. Like I often find that I resort to like communicating with people over like a private HipChat or Slack channel just to sort of like reinforce that it's not that I'm not the code and that it's fixable. So I don't know. That's a tough one for me to get over.
Okay.
Feedback. I'm asking for feedback on something that I tend to do on PRs when I see things, especially if they're mostly suggestions for what can make it better. I tend to use we, could we change this way, or how would you feel if we did it this way? And I wonder if that's helpful or if it's, I don't know, it's not helpful. I tend to do it, but I'm like, does that really sound like it's not actually a suggestion anymore?
Yeah, I see what you mean. So the question is about how you refer to people in PRs and the difference between saying you should do this versus we may want to consider this, using you versus we. I'm mixed on this one again. Sometimes I will say we if it depends how involved I am with that work also. If I'm somewhat tangentially involved with the actual creation of the PR, then I will tend to use we a bit more. But I personally I would say more of the time I refer to an individual, but I sort of try to be humble and make it a suggestion if it truly is a suggestion. Like you may want to consider this, not you should do this or you have to do this.
One thing that we do in art school, I have to give feedback to students and also was a student at one time. So, and it's definitely a huge thing. You are not your work. This sort of separation of the work and breaking it down based on I can take a look at your slide and we could talk objectively about the goals you have for that slide and how successfully they've been met. But we would talk about the slide, or maybe in this case the code, and say, I see it does this, does that. Maybe it could do this better, but it's always about the work and not about you could do this. Or in this case we could do this, but definitely make it take people out of it, and you're just talking about whether or not this thing meets this criteria, and of course it's very subjective too, but that's one thing that you get to tell people to do, to keep from mass hysteria.
Yes.
That is a really good suggestion, because code, there is no one right way to code most of the time, and it is subjective, and that's where we ran into trouble because there were strong personalities saying, no, this is the right way, no, this is the right way. I'm like, either way is right.
Yes. Yes, it's a difficult situation to work around if there's fundamental disagreement. And again, something that's touched on much more in depth in the book that I didn't think was as universally relevant maybe to Detroit Labs. But again, fully recommend reading the book. It has so much of this kind of useful information in it. Yes, Mark, that's an interesting idea. Mark's suggestion was to talk very objectively about the work as presented and almost completely abstract mention of individuals when doing so. For PRs, I kind of feel like because it's not a finished product, that's kind of a little bit more difficult, because you are saying to someone, you need to go back, you need to go back and change this.
I could do that. We do that in review and say this. I could say with this slide, I'm like, well, I think you've done a really good really good job of. I think this slide. See, I already used you. It's hard.
Yes.
But this slide conveys the topic really well. There's a large bold headline and 3 bullet points to support that. I think maybe this slide could do that a little bit more effectively if, one, it has a visual element paired with that type to reinforce the message, and 2, if there were a hierarchical relationship between, if there was a paired set of typefaces that, with a display type and a body copy type, made this visually a little bit more stimulating.
Right, right. So I guess the equivalent would be, in this case, the feedback is sort of focused on what the slide could do, and the equivalent for a PR would be on what the code could do. You know,
Yeah.
this code might be more robust if, or this code could be slightly clearer if, rather than you could make this clearer if.
Or
Yeah.
just like the switching but to and, maybe just try to avoid using you.
Yes.
If you can. So like consider using if let here, or you know.
Yes.
This might be better as a guard.
Yes.
Something like that, instead of like you should have used a guard here.
Yes.
Like
Yes. Yeah. Where you can abstracting away mention of specific
not to the
people.
point where it's like
Yeah.
awkward and clunky to try and say something without.
Agree. Yeah. It's difficult. One thing, again, this is a Nate West shout out, but you posted a while ago. I don't know if this was general or just to me, but this link on E prime. Do you remember that? Okay, it's basically like a way of talking in which you avoid ascribing intentions to anyone else. And I was like, that would be really, then I didn't really have the time to put it in the talk, but this idea that you should be able to convey and explain things in a way that does not implicitly like ascribe a specific intention to anyone else, because you really don't know their intention. You can't know their intention unless you specifically ask. So I toyed with the idea of trying to learn enough about E prime to like experiment with writing PRs using E prime only, and to see how easy it is to write without like accidentally ascribing intention to someone. This is kind of along the same lines of avoiding saying this needs to change because you did it wrong, or trying to get away from any sort of personal link between what you're saying about the code and what you're saying about the person. So that's kind of an interesting side point, maybe. Any more? Yeah, then.
I kind of wondered before if maybe it would be helpful to adapt like tagging your comments with needs to change, informative, my opinion.
That's a very interesting idea, actually. Yeah, I'm sure you saw yesterday that GitHub have finally responded to some of that open source request and made these default templates for issues. It seems like that could be useful if you were able to comment on specific comments or tag specific comments. I don't know, Brian has been using this tool called pull approve on open source libraries, which basically prevents pull requests from being merged before someone has explicitly typed approve in a comment. And you can set up various combination rules. It's kind of like how the GM team runs, I think, but it's just a GitHub integration that does this. I wonder if pull approve has any functionality to say, like, if this word is included in this comment, like this checkbox must be marked before it is able to be merged, as a way of like hacking around required. Maybe that's something we did on for a while, where we had a QA flow that required several steps of checking, as we had checkboxes, and the pull request would be merged once those checkboxes were all checked.
So like a little like emojis, like urgent, like critical, informative.
Yeah, you like
in front of your comment to indicate like
yes.
This is just as a suggestion versus this is important.
I fully support an emoji-based system of priorities. Yes. One of my favorite combinations on refactor PRs is toilet flushed. But yeah. So you could probably come up with some system. Like I will, if someone's commented and I'm going to fix something, I will typically comment with like a check mark emoji to indicate, yes, this is now taken care of. We all good? Alrighty.